Eve is just here. Pardon me? He was just here 2 seconds ago. He probably just went to the washroom.
All good.
Wait 12 minutes.
Hello and welcome to this afternoon's panel conversation, The Legacy of Activism at Concordia, where we'll hear from people who organized and mobilized Concordians and gave us the legacy of an activist university. We are streaming on YouTube live from Concordia University's fourth space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tchage, Montreal. Here at Fourth Space, we collaborate with our university community to bring together around the research projects, initiatives, and dialogues in development across the university. We're fortunate to collaborate with today's event organizers to host this conversation. We are running this event as a live streamed meeting, so we welcome your comments and questions with a raised hand via the chat if you're joining via Zoom, and for those of you in the space. If you'd like to participate, just let us know by raising a hand and we'll be sure to get a microphone to you. Have a great conversation, everyone. Over to you, Nalini.
Thank you. Thank you. So welcome to the Legacy of Activism at Concordia, which is part of the CSU's Get Radical series. And huge thanks to Florencia Vallejo for organizing this series for us. Yes, a lot of work went into this. So we're here at the Sir George Williams campus of Concordia University to discuss those heightened moments that offer a political alternative for the university, where students came together as a collective rather than through the usual mode of the individual achievement that's valued at a university. So we're here to reflect on those moments, or even those unfinished moments at Concordia University, moments where our students made headlines around the world for their activism. These long and difficult struggles have laid the groundwork, if not necessarily for the university, for our understanding of education as a means for liberation. We're joined by 3 guests, 1 on Zoom and 2 in person. And they've all shaped the legacies of Concordia's activism. And I'll begin by reading the bios provided. So starting with Ermac Bahar, who was a student activist at Concordia in the lead up to and during the historic 2012 student strike, otherwise known as the Maple Spring. She's been involved in a number of community and labor organizing efforts over the past decade, including as campaigns coordinator for the CSU, right? When she's not organizing or talking about organizing, she likes to spend her time outdoors, preferably at a forest or on the beach. Next, in person, we have Yves Engler. Thank you for being with us. Yves Engler is a Montreal-based activist who's published an impressive number of 12 books, most recently Stand on Guard for Whom. 10 of his 12 titles are about Canada's role in the world. Yves first became active in Canadian foreign policy issues in the early 2000s, initially focused on anti-corporate globalization organizing. The year he was elected vice president of the Concordia Student Union, Benjamin Netanyahu was blocked from speaking at the university to protest Israel war crimes and anti-Palestinian racism. The protests sparked a massive backlash against student activism on campus, including Yves' expulsion from the university for attempting to take his elected position with the student union, while banned from campus for his supposed role in what the administration described as a riot. And claims from supporters of the Israeli Prime Minister that Concordia was a hotbed of anti-Semitism In recent years, Yves has sought to mobilize activists to confront politicians through peaceful direct action. He's interrupted about 24 speeches, press conferences by the Prime Minister, ministers, and opposition party leaders to question their militarism, anti-Palestinian positions, climate policies, imperialism in Haiti, and efforts to topple Venezuela's government. He's founder of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. Thank you both for being here in person. And I'll turn to now Rodney John. Rodney, it's nice to see you again.
Thank you. It's nice being here. Sorry I couldn't be there.
No, we're happy you can join us by Zoom. So Rodney John attended the university when it was known as Sir George Williams University from 1965 to 1969, which is a year we'll be talking about. And then he attended Concordia later from 1972 to 1980. Rodney was one of the original 6 students who stepped forward to complain about unfair grades they received from a professor, Perry Anderson, who was biased against Black students in his physiology class. After a protracted and stalled negotiation with administration, Rodney John and hundreds of others occupied the university's hall building across the street. They occupied the 9th and 7th floors in protest of anti-Black racism. Rodney John is now a psychotherapist and mediator based in Toronto. Welcome. And lastly, I'm Nalini Mohabir. I'm an associate professor in the geography department, and I've been doing some research on the 1969 student protests here. Most recently, I've published an issue of the journal Topia with a colleague, Ronald Cummings, which looks at the legacies of the Sir George Williams occupation. So, this is meant to be an opportunity for us to learn about various moments in Concordia's history that still speak to the legacies of activism that we've inherited today. And I think I'll start off by just asking you to maybe describe what was the turning points, asking each of you, we'll go around, to describe what was the turning points that turned this from perhaps a small-scale protest to something that became a mass movement. Maybe we'll start with the most recent and work our way.
All good? Okay, perfect. Thanks for being here, everyone, and thanks for inviting me to speak. So the question is, what changed? What went from?
So maybe if you could give us a little bit of context to the situation in 2012, and how did it become what was known as the Maple Spring?
Right. I mean, a lot of work, you know, to put it simply. But maybe I'll do a quick overview, although people might be more or less a little bit familiar with it. So in 2011, the provincial government came forth with a proposal to increase tuition for Quebec students by 75% over the course of 5 years. This was something that we knew was coming because there had been a freeze in place up until maybe 2007, and then there was a 35% increase between 2007 and 2012. And so because that increase was coming to an end, there was a question of what was going to happen. And predictably, they decided to, go even a step further, right? Making education even more inaccessible. And so the organizing had started years in advance, right? There was an incredible amount of work to be done, right? Having lots of difficult conversations, lots of repetitive conversations over and over again to talk to all of our peers and figure out what we're going to do about this. Are we going to take this and accept it and let the Quebec education system, become more Americanized? Or are we going to stand up and say no? We have to draw the line somewhere. And while things may not be perfect, we're definitely not going to allow them to get worse. So we spent, I mean, at Concordia, I can speak for myself, right, that we had been working for well over a year before that announcement was ever made to get students together, right, and realize this is coming and figure out what our response was going to be. And so I think it almost seems like it couldn't have gone any other way, right, because there was such preparation, because we knew that it was coming and we had been organizing for so many years. Yeah.
Okay. And what were some of the goals that you were working towards?
Yeah, so we had, that's an interesting thing, right? As in any movement, there's definitely a difference of opinion. I personally wanted there to be free education. If anything, you know, students should be paid for going to school because we are, well, I'm not a student anymore, but I'll always say we, because students are workers in training, right? And if you have that concept of education as something that's productive and necessary for society and not a product, right, to be sold, then it makes sense, right, for education at the minimum. But of course, that wasn't necessarily an agreed upon, you know, base floor within the movement. But we came to an agreement that we were going to reject the proposed increase and that we wanted a tuition freeze. And so over the course of several years, students across Quebec, you know, organized in CEGEPs and departments, right? And we built up momentum. We had many different types of actions. Of course, you know, there's attempts at conversations and meetings, at petitions, protests, one-day strikes, sit-ins, occupations, and eventually it culminated in the launching of a huge, you know, 6-month-long strike in February 2012, where we had, you know, at the height of it, about 3/4 of students in Quebec being on strike. And we had about over 200,000 students, you know, walking these streets on March 22nd of 2012. And that was really the height of it. And I'm happy to say that, you know, when we were successful, right? We won. The strike triggered the provincial election, right? And is credited with unseating the PLQ government. And the PQ at the time had run on a promise to freeze, to get rid of, I think they promised to get rid of the hike, which they delivered, but rather than freezing it, unfortunately, it was indexed to inflation, right? Yeah.
Thank you. I just think that was such an incredible moment because not only were there this mass body of students taking to the streets, but also, you know, ordinary Montrealers joining in, right, with the pots and pans, maybe people who wouldn't normally take part in protest, you know, middle-class homeowners, for example, but yeah, it was incredible solidarity that you built.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an incredible time to be 20, you know, like to say that you helped unseat a provincial government at 20 years old is, it's pretty cool. And at the time, it really felt like the world was full of possibilities, right? And it seemed normal. And of course that we did that and it was going to, you know, we're going to keep doing that.
Incredible, thank you. And Yves, could you tell us a little bit about maybe the frictions as well as the goals of the 2002 protests and how it became, it was centered on Concordia and then it also became something that was large scale and made international headlines.
Yeah, so I think, you know, Concordia played an important role in spurring the pro-Palestinian movement across student activism that we see, you know, increasingly kind of officialized or accepted. And I myself was elected on the 4th year of a left-wing slates of the student union. So there had been like 3 years of radical left-wing student unions that had kind of politicized the union, allowed for a sort of structure within the student union that was, you know, more activist oriented than sort of bureaucratic. And early in that year, so because there had been big pro-Palestinian mobilizations at Concordia in the previous years, and almost entirely organized by people of Palestinian descent, set up groups like SBHR, that comes out of that time, which has been around for 20 years now, Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights. And so the pro-Israel lobby wasn't happy with that. They referred to it in some contexts as the viper's nest. That's what Concordia was, a very sort of racist kind of imagery. And they wanted to really show that, like, sort of put the pro-Palestinian and more generally the left-wing student union kind of on the back foot. They'd effort a year before, after the 9/11 in the US, Twin Towers, there was a student union handbook that B'nai B'rith 2 weeks later, after 9/11, referred to as the blueprint for Osama bin Laden's youth network. So that was the student union, Concordia Student Union's handbook, because it was like pro-Palestinian, anti-capitalist, feminist, anti-consumerist, whatever, anti-imperialist. They framed it as this, really radical text that was, whatever, right? And there was an effort to unseat the student union, and it was the first phase of it. There was actually a referendum called to try to unseat the student union, and the administration kind of had their hands in that process. But so we won, the student union I was part of, we won after this effort. It was a kind of surprise win, the growing and growing kind of like hostility in the corporate media against the student union. And the idea was the more right-wing forces were going to win the student union elections. And we won, surprise to kind of most people, including us. We won by a big margin. And then early in the student year, a couple days into the new semester in September, pro-Israel groups tried to have Netanyahu speak at H110. The Concordia security had said, this doesn't make sense. It's got to be out at the ice rink out at Loyola campus. That is easier to secure and whatever. But there was a real push to have it downtown, which is, again, designed to sort of like provoke kind of conflict and whatever. And that's what happened. Basically, the Concordia didn't want to completely militarize the campus. The Concordia Security Administration didn't want to militarize the campus, so they wanted their security to keep control of the campus to allow the hall building to operate. And their security wasn't able to stop protesters from taking control of the mezzanine. And then there was the protesters. We took control of the mezzanine, and then the escalators down to the first floor, where people were walking in to go to the Netanyahu event, which I should say wasn't just like an academic lecture. It was like a pro-Israel rally, right? They were announcing, bring your Israeli flag. They were, people with Arab names weren't getting tickets. It wasn't like sort of this open debate kind of whatever. It was a pro-Israel rally. And the Montreal police, as the Montreal police have a tendency to do, they got violent with the protesters that were controlling the escalators up to the mezzanine. But there was also hundreds of people outside that were part of the protest. And basically, as the police got more and more violent against the protesters inside, the people outside were getting more and more kind of riled up, and eventually they break the window out front, and then the police completely lose it. They start firing, they claim only pepper spray. Honestly, I'm pretty sure there was some tear gas, but they claim only pepper spray. But irrespective, I was actually not even down at the protest at the moment. I was up in the 6th floor in the student union office when the actual moment happens, and like hundreds of students are leaving their class because they can't, the air is there, they can't really breathe properly. And basically, the Netanyahu protest or the Netanyahu rally is canceled. Police are, running around through the hall building, driving protesters out, and students are just like sort of escaping. Random students have nothing to do with what's going on. And of course, then the whole kind of world comes down the next day, or later that day, and all the pro-Israel groups say that there was all this anti-Semitism. There were Jewish people being targeted because they were Jewish, and all this kind of stuff. I'm sure there was examples of that. I personally didn't see it, but I'm guessing there was probably more anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian racism that took place. But the administration then went overboard, and they basically blocked all discussion of Israel-Palestine in university. So if you were in a Middle East studies class and you wanted to ask about Palestine, you had to actually ask your professor, can I ask a question about Israel-Palestine? They banned any political activity in the first floor and the second floor and the mezzanine of the whole building. And back then we used to actually table in the first floor. They actually, I think they basically won that, never really returned. And then they gave themselves the power to expel any student as they wished. And over the next 2 months, we basically, we rejected what their repressive measures after the Netanyahu protests they'd introduced. About 5 weeks later, they arrest me for handing out leaflets about the free trade area of the Americas. We were having a big mobilization. That was a follow-through from the FTA protests in Quebec City in 2001, where up to 50,000 people marched. And kind of 1.5 years later, we organized a hemispheric-wide student strike against the free trade area of the Americas. It was towards 10,000 people actually that marched in Montreal on October 31st of 2002. And we were mobilizing towards that, and so we were rejecting the idea that we couldn't be leafleting, we couldn't have a political space within the campus after the Netanyahu protests. And then they went even a step, and that got them a whole bunch of bad press. They actually sent, I think it was 19 cop cars. I was in the 6th floor of the student union preparing for an exam the next day, and the 19 cop cars were sent to take me out of the student union. And that got, that Montreal police were, even the Montreal Gazette sort of mocked the Montreal police for doing that. And then a couple weeks later, they maintained this ban on Israel-Palestine discussion. And so when we tried to bring Libby Davies and Sen Robinson, who were then 2 NDP MPs, parliamentarians, to come speak on the question, and they blocked them. They actually got a court injunction to block MPs from being able to speak on campus about Palestine. And so then we held the discussion out front, a rally, and then that just elicited even more embarrassment for the administration. And then finally, by the end of the year, they withdraw. The Board of Governors formally withdraws these repressive measures they brought in after the Netanyahu affair. So it was in some ways it was sort of like one event, this Netanyahu thing, but it opened up a whole bunch of political stuff, mobilization, and that one event was sort of somewhat of the culmination, if you want to call it that, of years of pro-Palestinian activism, years of radical left-wing student activism, and I think that now. Most people would say that Benjamin Netanyahu is a war criminal, that is responsible for an apartheid system. And on the day of the September 9th, the Netanyahu thing, one of the things that was being was like a citizen's warrant to arrest Netanyahu for his war crimes when he was the prime minister in the mid-90s in Israel. So I think that certainly in progressive opinion, the ideas that we were pushing have now become much more sort of accepted ideas.
Maybe accepted now, but I cannot imagine the courage that it would have taken in that post 9/11 environment to take the actions that you did and to speak out. Even today it's still hard, but also thank you for reminding us of the silencing that happened during that time, and I wonder what it must have been like for Palestinian students or faculty, not to be able to speak to their own experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I can't obviously speak to that directly in personal experience, but I think that undoubtedly the idea for Palestinian students at Concordia, the idea that the administration would bend over backwards to have Netanyahu come speak downtown, open the door, anything you want, bring your Israeli flags, decide who gets to go inside the room, all this kind of stuff. It was an obvious assault to Palestinians many people who had family members directly, obviously all Palestinians indirectly, but directly harmed by Netanyahu's policies, and then that continuation afterwards of just sort of the repressive measures. So no doubt that it was a real sort of, just, essentially racist contempt towards Palestinians on the campus.
Thank you. There's so much there that we need to return to, but I'd like to turn to Rodney John on Zoom to share with us a little bit about how a conflict over grading becomes such a mass movement.
Our conflict did not have the clarity of the left-right distinction that the last speakers had. And that even to this day, I try to, upon reflection, ask myself, what was it all about? At base, it had to do with racism. It had to do with identity. It had to do with class. And it had to do with the traumatic consequences of negating a person's sense of who they are for arbitrary means, period. I was thinking the other day, it's hard to go back to the 60s and think of what it was like being at Concordia as a student from the West Indies. And I made that, you might have noticed I did not say as a Black student. And that is why? In growing up, I was simply a West Indian with all the nuances of shades of color, the privilege of the white upper class, the consequences of being poor. But we did not identify ourselves as Black. When I came to Canada, I discovered that I was, first of all, colored. Secondly, that I was a Negro. And within a couple of years, I then became Black. So within the time I came in 65, by the time the 69, I had transitioned from being a Negro colored person to being a Black person. Now, what happened then? You go to class as a Black person. The identification of who you are is done by the other. They determine who you are because of your skin color. Now, if you are, let's say the person does not like you because you are arrogant, because you are obsequious, or because of anything, there are traits that you can do something about. When they do not like you because of your color, there is no damn thing you can do about it. But the fascinating thing is that to this day, I'm 80 years old, and I still reflect on the fact that because of my color, it was determined that I was incapable of passing an exam, but in order to ensure that I did not pass the exam, I would lose marks based on my color, nothing else. It's what happened is that the othering that people of color face, it does not allow us to have an identity that is grounded in who we are. And the person who makes a judgment of who we are does not have to account to anyone for the basis on which that judgment was made. And so one is left in terms of one's sense of who one is, often wondering, is that judgment that is made of me, is it who I am really? How much of it is what is coming from me, and how much of it is being projected onto me? We talk about the Black community, and I'll come back to what made the St. George event such a seminal act. It was by identifying those of us who are othered based on whatever category it is. The people who have lived through that experience identify with it. All of a sudden, you understand what it is like to be judged based on criteria that you're not at all familiar with. You have no idea what is happening, what is going on, why is this so? When you are in the community, you meet up with someone, as I've been mentioned, you meet up with someone who is from Trinidad or from Jamaica or from Barbados, and all of a sudden you recognize they are your kin, but they're still other. They have differences that you can recognize. When you are with the larger community, that distinction, those factors that lead to differences in identity become erased. You are simply a Black person, a caricature that is defined by someone else who determines how far you go, what the limits are. And so what happened was that when this event, and the event took place over for us, it took place over a little over two years. It came at the time when in 65, I don't remember what it was, in Martin Luther King died in 68, Malcolm X in 65. There was the protests in the States. And so the St. George affair was anchored in a larger scene of protest of Blacks attempting to find an identity that was meaningful. And protesting against the act of a professor resonated with the larger community. People identified with it. This is really what was a problem. And that led to the events. It was a challenge to the administration to recognize that the behavior that was being protested in the narrow confines of the classroom simply represented a behavior that was part and parcel of the entire administration structure. And so when we thought we were seeking redress of a narrow problem, that narrow problem was simply a reflection of a larger problem that the administration at that point had absolutely no interest in looking at, much less giving up. And I am 53 years later. I look back on it, and it saddens me, because I ask why, what for, what was it all about? Have things changed? At some level, things have changed. But at the fundamental level of human beings and identity, very little has changed. It is convenient to divide the world into black and white. It is much less convenient to look at the variations of identity that exist within those classifications, and recognizing that from the outside, you have no idea who the individual is when you make judgments based on what you think are meaningful characteristics. I have not been as coherent about the facts around 69, but I'm prepared to answer those questions if anyone is interested. But I'm more intrigued by the fact that after all of these years, the consequences of what that period of time, it derailed the trajectory of my life, that event. Where I would have ended up, I do not know. And even after having obtained a number of degrees, 5 in all, I still feel as if somehow I have not accomplished what I set out to do because of a judgment of someone as to who I was as an individual. And the question is whether or not, as a society, at Sir George, whether or not these kinds of judgments are still being made. Or can people be persuaded that to change?
Thank you so much for that very poignant description of what happened, and for reminding us of what's at stake in terms of identity, for reminding us that what happens in the classroom can be a symptom of wider geopolitics, that issues like civil rights, decolonization in the Caribbean, that these issues seem, or perhaps we're taught to think of them as separate from Canada in the 1960s, separate from the history of Quebec in the 1960s, but they were all interconnected through that moment when Professor Perry Anderson decided to mete out unfair treatment towards his students from the Caribbean. I want to return to so much of what you said, but perhaps I'll shift focus just a little bit and then come back to you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm just so struck by, in each time period that we're thinking of, it sounds like there was a certain mood that captured the spirit of protest. And Ermac, in hearing you speak, there was a kind of, I don't know, explosive energy around the movement. And what did it feel like at the time for you?
Incredible. So, I mean, to try to paint a picture of, what it looked like, those 6 months of strike for the most part, right? I'm gonna get a little mechanical into it, but every week, individual student associations, students that had gone on strike in their departments would have weekly general assemblies, right? And they would discuss whether to stay on strike, and they would debate every aspect of the movement, right? The government would come to us with proposals. They would propose, hey, instead of 75% over 5 years, what if we did 82% over 7 years? Yeah, I didn't misspeak, that was a legitimate proposal. And so we discussed that, right, at General Assemblies. We discussed what to do about the incredible amount of state repression and violence. We discussed what the definition of violence was, it was property destruction violence. So there's all these lively, deeply personal and also philosophical debates happening at those General Assemblies. And then they would come and continue to be debated at the provincial level, at Congress, right, where each General Assembly would send delegates to only represent what students had voted on. So this is, there was a lot of discussion, there was a lot of excitement. There's people were constantly learning, constantly debating. At the height of the strike, I know that personally, my experience is I would be waking up at the crack of dawn. There'd be some kind of an economic blockade in action going on where there would be, a blockade of a bank or a bridge or something. Then, head to campus and there would be lots of other things to do. Maybe there's a General Assembly where, that needs some kind of that I would help with facilitating or logistically. There would be protest flyers to make and other activities. There's at the height of it, there are evening protests every single evening in Montreal, especially after Law 78 was passed, which is a draconian law that attempted to completely remove get rid of the freedom to assemble altogether. And those nightly protests, they would be in the thousands every single night, right? So there's also endless creativity, right? And students no longer were spending all their time in classes and studying and contributing, right, to our economic system. There's this burst of creative actions. There's theater. There's so much excitement happening. So I would say, that it was a wonderful time to be alive. It was really exciting. I think really proud to have built such a large movement that we had organized not just each other, right, not just our fellow students, but I would say broad sections of the general population as well. And yeah, it was a wonderful time. It was also an unusually warm spring and we're just out in the streets every single day. And the world, as I said before, just felt full of possibilities. At least for me, I know that was not, I think when I look back, those are the things that stand out, and those are the things that I want to convey to everyone right now. But of course, there's also incredible amounts of repression and violence and so much more, But maybe we'll get those at another point.
We will, but just to come back to the point that you made, that it was an incredible moment to be a part of. How did it shape you? What has it left you with in terms of a sense of purpose?
I think it's raised my expectations, right, of what's possible. I've seen the lengths to which, university administrators and government officials, politicians will go to repress movements. But I've also saw the power that ordinary people have when we come together. And we're powerful, you know? There's really no limits to what we can achieve if we figure out how to come together and act. So it raised my expectations, and yeah.
Thank you. If you had a difficult context that you were operating in, which sounds very, very stressful at the time, how was it in terms of what was the process at the student union or among the wider student body? Were you trying to work towards some kind of consensus? Was that even possible? What was the deliberation process like?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were engaged in many different political battles. Is the reality. Like later on in our year, the student union, the Americans do the invasion of Iraq, right? In March of 2003. So we end up getting involved in mobilizing students to these demonstrations in Montreal. That the biggest one officially was over 200,000 people. I don't think it was quite that big, but it was a good 100,000, 150,000 on a really, really cold day. So we were involved in lots of different political struggles, and to some extent, there were divergences of opinion within the student union. There was lots of tensions within the student union on all kinds of different issues, personal tensions, political tensions, and so some of those those things were not always easy to deal with, and there was errors made. For instance, Hillel, after the administration withdraws the ban on political activities, Hillel, which is a Jewish cultural organization, but also a pro-Israel. I mean, it doesn't have to be, but in practice, it has been a pro-Israel kind of organization. They did something that was very provocative, with the intent of kind of stoking conflict in the student union. Unfortunately, in my opinion, suspended them, and then that was then turned into, I think one of the quotes was, this was the first Jewish student group, cultural club that had been suspended since 1936 Germany or something like that, right? It's like, and that was a serious strategic error. Whether it was a moral error or not, that's a different question. But yeah, so there was lots of different debates and divergences of opinion, but I think that for me, this was a lucky situation, and I don't think it's been replicated since, to a large extent, is that the student union whole structure had been, over 4 years, actually a little bit longer than that, had been opened up, politically speaking, to be a political organization and not to just sort of be bureaucratic and oversee services. And so that basically meant that if you were within this, well, certainly among the executive, but even on the council, or even quite frankly, just like in the milieu, you could come in and use our printing facilities and print your pamphlet about the anarchist critique of the global economy. You could come in with green capitalism, and so it became a space that really like facilitated organizing, mobilization on all kinds of issues. There were certain things that, so yeah, I guess that sort of at a structural level, for me personally, I was able to sort of engage in many different political battles throughout the year, and I think that's ultimately, I think that's a very healthy nature of a student union versus most of the student unions, which are about career advancement, about sort of kind of overseeing things, organizing maybe some parties, whatever. But that it really became a political tool, and they went hard. I mean, they went hard to get the radicals out, right? Like there were ads for the next student union election. There were ads, full-page ads in the Globe and Mail telling people to go vote in the student union elections. There was like, I can't say what the number was, but almost certainly into the hundreds of thousands of dollars that were put into, all under the auspices of like get the vote out, but it was really like get the left-wing student unions out, because they've been, engaged in too many different political campaigns that, threaten power. Yeah.
Can I ask about, just coming back to that interesting moment about how one might open up and share the space and thereby politicize the space of the student union. Did that lead to coalition building or combining with groups maybe outside of the university as well?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Like, one of the things that I was part of in setting up at the time was a group called Block the Empire. So there was, these mass demonstrations, mostly organized by Échec à la Guerre against Canada joining the American-led invasion of Iraq. And basically what Block the Empire was let's ratchet it up a notch, right? So we had to block the American consulate early one morning at 6 or 7 a.m. to shut it down, trying to basically just sort of amp up the mobilizations taking place, and it's directed a bit more, I don't know if you call it more radical or more direct action, whatever you want to call it. And how that kind of came together was this Scott Weinstein was the main person. He was, I don't know, probably 40 years old at the time, and Concordia was just sort of the hub of activism around Anglophone activism in Montreal, and just kind of comes down and participates, and a few of us end up setting it up and whatever. So it is no doubt it brought together groups. Like I mentioned, the Free Trade Area of the Americas protest that was coordinated by a number of the student unions across Montreal and across Quebec, and the CSU was right at the center of that, and so yeah.
Just thinking about how we amplify voices when we come together. Thank you. Rodney, I was wondering what it was like when you were in the process of occupying the computer center on the 9th floor. What was the energy in the room? What were some of the conversations taking place amongst the students?
Let me see. That the occupation was a culmination of protests, that activities that actually started in September of the academic year before. Because these events had a genesis in 67, 68. There was a meeting, it's with the Dean of Students, the Dean of Science, the chairman of the department, and Anderson, and at that time there were about 13 students who had issues with Anderson over the academic year. And to put this in context, for me personally, in the academic year of 66, 67, 65, 66, I was told by a student that Anderson did not like West Indians and I should avoid his class. And I bring it up because the class he taught was a prerequisite if you were doing an honors degree or if you wanted to go on to medicine. It was a gateway class, so you had to take it. So the warning came in, but I had no problem, I had no idea, that no capacity to avoid that. And so this went on the year. Over that year, we all had it. So what I'm saying is that the issues had been percolating for quite a while within a certain segment of us. We had a meeting in April or May of 68. And this was with the administration in an attempt to reconcile the issues that we had brought up to them over the year. They were supposed to get back to us. That meeting was on a Sunday. They were supposed to get back to us with the decision that they had made based on the information we were giving them. And there were two of us who were going to be in town over that summer. Terence Ballantyne, I think Douglas Masop, and myself. We waited over the summer and no information came. We get back to school in September of 68, only to find out that Anderson had been given clearance. Reports had been made, but no one had a copy of the report. So we went back through the process of trying to figure out what would happen. The principal, Ray, at the time, what we were told was that he had, a report had been sent to him, but it had been lost in the internal mail. I have to give that background because from September, October, November, December, January, we spent time trying to get this issue reconciled. The problem that we were facing at that time was trying to deal with it as an issue of student equity. We as students had a right to a hearing if we had an issue with a professor. One of the problems that we faced with that was that there was a certain implicit question as to whether or not, as Black students, we had a legitimate right to be treated as students. I spent a number of hours between September and up until the occupation in January, every day at speaking for hours to students, presenting the case that we as students, there were any number of students for whom the first question they would ask would be, well, can you prove to me that Anderson is guilty and then I will support you? And I would say, well, what we're asking for is the opportunity to present to the student body in an unbiased fashion so that you can make the decision based on that. We're not asking you to support us up front, but rather whether or not you support us as students. And for a lot of students, they could not make that jump. We were not seen as legitimate students. We were, for many students, this was not true for the whole body. Because at the height of the occupation, we would have a couple of hundred students who came. But that was part of the issue that we, the conflict, the tension that we had to deal with. So in the occupation itself, it was probably, it was very intense. I'm trying to go back to those days. By that time, those of us who were involved had given up our year. And so it was what we had done was consequential. We had no idea where it was going to, how it was going to end. We hoped it would end well, but there was always a possibility that it would not. And so it was very, very, very intense. You had a lot of conflictual feelings. Many of us were immigrant students for whom failure was not an option. But at the same time, we had no choice. We could not go back. We had, you know, as in Macbeth, we had no choice but to go forward, no matter what the consequences. And it was, you had many different factions. So on the one hand, you had the 6 students who were at the core of the original complaint. At varying levels, you had people with various interests. So you had people who were politically involved. It was a time full of chaos. We did not have any idea how things were going to end. I think that for most of that period, we did not know what was going to happen next. The thing is that from September throughout, all attempts at getting the problem reconciled were rebuffed. The occupation was an attempt to force the administration to take a stand. The hope was that they would do the right thing. I'm speaking now that in retrospect, it was clear that they were not going to do the right thing, because to do the right thing would have meant accepting the fact that the entire institution was complicit in this behavior against minority students. We did not know it at the time that it would end with the police, but in retrospect, that is where it was headed. Yeah.
I think you just bring up so much for us to contemplate. One, the fact that this was not an easy or rushed decision to occupy the computer center on the 9th floor and the faculty lounge on the 7th floor, that there was attempts to find another way, but the administration prevented that from happening. That some of the conversations that you were having, you raised the issue of equity, and I can't help but think that when we think about periods of time that are fall outside of the contemporary period, we're often told that the set of questions that speak to those times are different from the ones of our contemporary period. We have to think about that time period in its context, but really it sounds like the questions then are the questions now, the questions of how does white supremacy operate in an institution? What does inclusion look like? Why have we waited 53 years for an answer to that?
If I may say something, there were any numbers of steps along the way in which the administration could have ended this, not this, that. It could have been ended. Even at the very end, when the police were called, and the police were called early in the night, and I know this because, well, that's a whole nother long story. Part of the problem is trying to compress something that took place over months, if not years, into, because February the 11th is what sticks into people's mind. February 11th was a culmination of almost a lifetime of struggle. When the police were there at that night, they came in before 1 o'clock. I was on my way out when I knew there was movement from the sub-basement into the up to the 13th floor. So the police were there. At that time, I don't remember who it was, but one of the Black professors attempted to negotiate with the authorities for an end, a peaceful end to the occupation. Okay, students will leave peacefully, and it was denied. And the notion was that, no, we are not going to let them leave peacefully after all of this. And in retrospect, one looks at along the way, every act that was an attempt to resolve the situation. And it is quite conceivable that had it not been an issue of Black students against a white professor, that had it been any other combination of students, that the matter would have been solved, because the matter was solvable. It was, the information was there. There was no need to, the information was given. It was solvable. Let me just give you one example. And one of the problems when I look at this situation is that February 11th has been told from many different perspectives. The one thing that has never been told is the details of what it did to the students who brought the complaints. Why did we bring the complaint? Okay, and the information was, so I'll give you this example. On the meeting that we had on the Sunday, as I said, there were about 13 students at the time, because we were third and fourth year students in 67, 68. And so half the class was going to be graduating at the end of that year and would not be back for 68, 69. Anyway, in the meeting, one of the complaints that we had brought about Anderson was that he had missed a number of classes without authorization. The chairman of the department, Dr. McLeod, showed up at the meeting ostensibly as Anderson's lawyer. Now, first of all, if Anderson needed a lawyer, it should not have been the chairman of the department representing him. He should have had his own lawyer. So Dr. McLeod announced to the group that of the complaints that the student had made, the first one he wanted to take up was the complaint that Professor Anderson had missed all of these classes without authorization. What he said was that he brought with him notebooks from 2 white students, not just 2 other students in class, although there were just some black students and white students in the class. But he brought notebooks from 2 white students that would indicate that Professor Anderson had not missed all of these classes. And he opened the notebook, he called a date, he called a second date, he called a third date. He was stopped by Kennedy Frederick and Doug Mossop. I said, Dr. McLeod, excuse me, but of the dates you've called out, it's Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. And our lectures were on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And there are 2 things about that. One of which is that he had contrived a response that was designed to show that we were misguided, misinformed, lying, or whatever. That was supposedly from white students. When he was called upon it, he closed the notebook and did not proceed. And the committee did not question him as to why he would pull such a stunt. We just continued as usual. And in retrospect, it says it really didn't matter what information came out. They were not going to do a damn thing about it.
There were certainly consequences to the administrative's action, and I hear it in your voice as you tell us what happened. And you raise a point that I think I'd like to turn to Yves and Ermac to also help us understand, and that point is around policing. And for those of you who might not be aware, in 1969, the administration ended the occupation of the hall building by calling the police on students, which resulted in 97 students being arrested, several of whom were international students. So their futures were placed at risk. 1 student died, also allegedly as a result of police violence. And we're currently in the middle of a student strike. Students at Concordia are on strike for a fall reading week. And yesterday, as I was coming to work, there was a drumming circle outside the hall building. And there were police there. It looked like somebody had called police on students that were protesting. So these issues are still highly, highly relevant and tells us the stakes. Can I ask, in 2012, what were some of the considerations around student safety that you were negotiating?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that was certainly not the last time that police have been on this campus, right?
Yeah.
We saw really, I think, pretty historically rare levels of repression, both on campus and elsewhere. right? Also in the streets. So we had
Negotiating.
and there was certainly a very high level of security present at all the student actions, at all the pickets. There were contracted out security guards that, at least on one occasion, were physically violent with students. We also saw, I mean, I'm sorry to say, but violence and homophobia and misogyny from other students, right? Specifically at pickets. But I would say that the most, really to me, shocking level of violence was out in the streets, right? The SPVM have, they're really something else, right? We saw really, there were so many sacrifices that were made, right? There were so many permanent injuries, multiple people losing their eyes because of, I believe it was tear canisters that were fired directly, or often rubber bullets fired directly at people's faces and then their bodies. Often those, night protests especially, they would end with a cloud of tear gas.
Yeah, it's, I mean, it's such an incredible moment that I think when I read about it, maybe I have a tendency to romanticize it a bit, but there
Me
were
too.
certainly lives that were impacted by it. And Yves, can I ask you, in 2002, there was, as you've alluded to, sort of perceptions around violence that you had to confront in the media around the students at Concordia, and maybe that students also experienced. What was that moment like?
Well, one of the Globe and Mail headlines about the Netanyahu protests was a day of broken glass, which of course is alluding to a night of broken glass, the beginning of Kristallnacht in Germany, the sort of major phase of anti-Semitism by the Nazis. So that was like a reframing what was 99.9% a justice-oriented solidarity movement, i.e. the protests against Netanyahu, into sort of a instance of hate so that was there was like a demonization that was kind of absolutely exaggerated the minimal level of what you call it violence. I mean, when police are beating up students, including Jewish students, on the escalator, and people outside break a window in kind of anger at what the police are doing, to frame that as, to connect that to Kristallnacht is absolutely disgusting. But I think kind of more generally around policing, I mean, I think that there are real questions. I don't think that, in lots of countries, police are not allowed to go onto campuses. Right now in Greece, there's been big efforts of changing the law around that, because there is a real history of police security forces going on campuses and killing people and repressing student demonstrations. And whether, obviously in our context, I think we're very far away from getting to bringing in legislation that would allow that, but certainly just at a more cultural level, the Concordia administration is way too willing to turn to bringing police onto campus. So that's kind of like one of those sort of I think political battles that you can probably have some impact on around the overuse, and even just the overuse of security. One of the things they started bringing in is these rules around having to pay for security. It's kind of a backdoor way of blocking pro-Palestinian events, was saying you have to pay for security to be at the event. We decide that you need 4 security officers to be there, and that's going to cost $500, $700, which basically makes that event, only maybe the student union could afford doing that, but the whatever group wouldn't be able to do that. And it's just like, it's a way of obviously shutting it down, but it's also a way of kind of demonizing it. It's sort of like dangerous. And it, played into, I think, a lot of sort of racist tropes about Palestinians or Arabs, heightened, I think, in the post 9/11 period. So yeah, you see that, like, I think one point that I came out from a personal level in interacting with student activists in Concordia is that the administrators and the academics, it's kind of like this liberal discourse of open debate, and we want to question power and all this kind of stuff. But when you pushed it a little bit, they were pretty quick to go to repressive measures, and quite frankly, the academics, when the administration does bring in all these repressive measures post Netanyahu protest, the number of academics that would stand up for just sort of like free speech kind of questions, including tenured professors, was pretty limited. And it wasn't even necessarily, wasn't necessarily that the more left-wing professors were more willing to stand up. Sometimes it was even actually just sort of kind of, serious liberals, people who actually believed the rhetoric around sort of some of the liberal rhetoric, that were willing to stand up on these things. So there was this kind of culture of, challenge authority, question power, protest, but when it started actually challenging power, the quickness to sort of shut it down through different repressive measures was pretty clear.
Just in wrapping up, I just have a final question for each of you before we open it up to the audience for questions. And Yves, could I come back to you and just ask given the intense energy around that moment in 2002, what are the legacies that came out of that moment? What were the shifts in public opinion? What are the contributions to the BDS movement today, or other shifts that you think happened?
Well, I mean, this is one question I think that is a kind of interesting question more generally about activism, is these, to take all this energy and most of the best activism, there's an institutional component to it, but it has to also have a sort of non-institutional component where if the institution won't be destroyed if depending on dynamics. But so one thing I think that, how to continue on with activism and stuff is the institutionalization of some of this sort of the ideas. And like the People's Potato came out of the left-wing activism of those 4 years. And it was a specific battle against a corporate deal that the administration had with a food provider. And some of the politics of the People's Potato is sort of, now it's more mainstream. Things like the Student Advocacy Center, that was one of the things that we set up. I don't know if it's still operating, but we set up during the year that I was in the student union. And so, the university kind of has, I think it's kind of a weird situation where on one hand, the liberal rhetoric and the dissent kind of thing is vastly exaggerated, but it also has it is a big, wealthy institution that you can set up things, be it like a PIRG, public interest research group, be it my partner worked at the Center for Gender Advocacy, and they set up the campaign that got the Sexual Assault Center. So you can, there's a lot that can be done to I don't know what the budget is, $200 million, to put $500,000 into a sexual assault center doesn't mean much to the administration, but can have quite important effects. So the ability, I think in some ways it's a little bit unique as an institution that people go through in life to have the ability to campaign for these initiatives that can then that aren't that difficult to win, but then have kind of long-term impacts. Now, specifically with regards to Palestine, like I mentioned earlier, the Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights SPHR comes out of the campaigning around Concordia in those years. The Netanyahu event did lead to, I should be very clear about it, it led to an incredible reaction, incredible backlash, and so, you know, put pro-Palestinian activism in some ways on a back foot for, you know, in different ways. But I think that the longer term legacy of that protest, that organizing that went on around that, is part of this change in, at least within progressive circles. It certainly is not at the level of our government. Our government, of course, is deeply complicit in Palestinian dispossession, and you know, it has been for before Israel was created. But in progressive, if you look at the shift in opinion within progressive circles on that question, it actually is quite remarkable how much more sympathy for you know, ending Canadian complicity in Palestinian dispossession there is. And I think that the Netanyahu protests and the activism around that, you know, is part of that movement of a shift in opinion.
Thank you. You mentioned remaking the university, and Ermac, I was wondering what your thoughts were on 2012. What's the impact it's had on remaking the university?
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about some of those organizations, because I was just reflecting that a lot of the things that maybe students take as granted right now in the landscape of Concordia University came in the aftermath of the 2012 strike. So the whole co-op movement at Concordia, right? Like that the fact that there's a student-run co-op bar, there's a daycare, which is kind of incredible. The Woodnote Housing Cooperative, the Hive, right? I think all of these did not exist before 2012, and they actually were created incredibly quickly over the course of just a few years. And that really came out of the sort of energy and excitement and ties, you know, that were built, and relationships that were built throughout the course of the strike in 2012. But I think, you know, more so beyond those organizations, behind those co-ops, a legacy of the 2012 strike would just be the use of strike as a tactic in Anglophone institutions, right? So this was not a thing prior to 2012. Concordia did not participate in the Quebec student movement in this particular way. Anglophone students in Quebec did not, right? They organized or participated in protest, but they did not go on strike, right? And so that's completely changed, right? There's been a number of strikes since. There's a strike in 2015. I want to say 2018. There's been longer strikes in those years. There's been limited one-day strikes. There's a strike right now, right? And students are participating. I think also the use of student unions, particularly at the departmental level, as political machines is also something that's come in the aftermath of 2012. Prior to that, I mean, often the CSU also, definitely, but especially departmental level and faculty level student associations were just glorified like party planners, right? And maybe they had some academic conferences here and there, but that was it. And since 2012, students have really more or less have put effort into using them as in a political way, right? So that's, I think, an important legacy that I continue to see at Concordia over the past 10 years. Yeah.
Thank you. And Rodney, can I ask, I just want to reframe the question slightly for you, because I think 1969 is still unfinished, and I hear, maybe, I don't know if trauma is the right word, but you know, certainly a pain from that moment that's still with you. What do we need in terms of repairing the relationship between the university and the students who lived through that moment in the wider Black community?
I've been struggling with that question. I don't have a coherent answer. You can look at the issue of politics. And politics, by and large, we're talking about an intellectual approach to understanding life. And it allows people to shift their politics. There are any number of people who have been progressives, and before they die, they turn into right-wingers that you wouldn't recognize, and so on and so on and so on. And so there's a lot of movement back and forth. The issue of racism, and particularly, speaking of myself, Black racism, is that it involves identity. And questions of identity are much more resistant to easy articulation and to change. How do you go about changing your identity? And how do you have a dialogue with what does it mean for two people who are of the same skin color to come to the world with the same identity? Okay. I always say I used to say, I don't know if I said very much anymore, is that true racial equality will exist when Black people are allowed to be rabid right-wingers and no one will raise an eyebrow. That's what's fine. When we get to that point, then I would say, you know what? We are there. You can convert someone with arguments. You can make them see that from a political point of view, that their relationship to the world is wrong. Okay, that it is discriminatory, it is X, Y, and Z. And you can convert them. But in terms of identity, how do you deal with the fact that your sense of who that person is based on something as unchanging as skin color? How can you convert the skin color into one that is less objectionable to those people who find it objectionable? What is the policy that you establish in order to get there? I don't see it happening. So the question really is that what does the university see as the problem that it should attempt to solve? Notice what I said, attempt to solve, and how might it go about making that attempt? Other than that, what I would is that in looking back, I recognize that the issues that I was fighting for were abstract. What was it? where the consequences for me were is that in looking back throughout my academic career, it was, how do I know that my assessment of whatever it is that I had to assess was accurately experienced, or was there some interpretation that had nothing to do with me and rather to do with how I am perceived? Because part of the problem really is that we still live in a world where we talk about Black people and white people. It's a daily occurrence. And I remember the last time I was in South Africa and recognized that in South Africa, you cannot talk about Black people and white people. You can, but it becomes meaningless if you're attempting to talk about the people who live in South Africa, because they are different. They're substantially different. Whether you're talking about the people from Ghana or Nigeria, or they're culturally different. And so that classification does not do justice to these individuals. I do not see anytime soon there being some way of identifying people besides we talk about Palestinians, and we talk about Israelis, and we talk about Jews, and we talk about, and the assumption really is that we're talking about homogeneity, but we're not.
I take your point. I think I perhaps asked a very simplistic question, and maybe also it's a question that can't be answered, because how does one repair the irreparable, really? I'm just cognizant of the time, and I really want to give our audience members an opportunity to engage with this incredible group of people that we have here today. I'm wondering if there's any questions from the audience.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here, for sharing those stories, those struggles. My name is Laura, I use they, them pronouns. I'm from McGill University, and our student union has struggled to keep its promises when it gets involved in political issues. The school is very often will threaten to break agreements with the student union, because right now the money that the student union has goes to the university, and then the university transfers it to the student union, and that's what allows us to have one. And every time, particularly on Palestinian rights issues, every time there is work that is being done, the school is like, we're gonna break the agreement, and the student union eventually steps down in fear that the agreement gets broken. Last year, there was a Palestinian solidarity policy that was passed after years of advocacy by Palestinian students and their allies on campus. And there was a striking majority in the referendum. And then the school did that thing where they were like, we're gonna break the agreement. And the student union eventually just took down the policy. So I'm wondering if you have any advice on politicizing student unions, but also thoughts on the limitations that student unions might have to act on those issues, and whether, from your experience, it is best to go through those channels or through channels that are outside the student union and build student power in ways that are maybe more autonomous than those that are linked to the institution. I don't know if my question makes sense, but.
Well, first of all, what McGill administration did is absolutely scandalous when 71% of students vote for the Palestine solidarity policy. And, you know, I think these, to me, all these questions are they're very particular. To talk about it in a general sense is I think, kind of a mistake. But this sort of be largely based upon balance of power, right? So if you think it's realistic to win all the seats on the executive of the student union, if that's actually a plausible scenario, then it's probably worth putting the energy into doing that. And if it's very implausible, then you're better off working through the PERG, working through the CKUT, working through whatever other group, or setting up an autonomous group. So I think that's not easy to answer without knowing really the specifics. I find it, again, this coming from the outside and not really knowing the internal dynamics of SMU, it to me is pretty outrageous how the SMU collapsed in the face of the administration pressure, because my understanding of the law is that there's provincial legislation on this. The university administration doesn't have the ability to stop the money. It's not up to administration. They have the ability to force SMU to take McGill out of its name, or they have ability to, that's my understanding of, So the threat of actually blocking the money, they can maybe pause the money, they can, do some things that make life difficult for the student union. But the fact that the SMU collapsed in the face of that pressure, to me, that speaks to how much SMU, the people who kind of run SMU, and I don't necessarily mean the people who are elected, but you have these staff people who are often there for a long time that make pretty good salaries, that the whole way they look at it is, how do I continue in my job at the student union? And that was part of the thing that when I talked about how I came in after 4 years at the CSU, I wasn't involved in those battles that kind of got rid of a lot of the people who were more careerist oriented that were around the student union. Those battles are all taken place in previous years, and those are, unfortunately, they can often be messy battles, but can be quite important battles to actually turn the student union into something that can mobilize. But to me, those questions are not, there is no answer. It's better to organize autonomously or better to organize through the student union. It's a question of the balance of power. And if you can turn a force, if you can have something, I don't know what SMU's budget is, but probably a couple $1 million, $3 million, $2-3 million. If you can turn that into an organizing and politicized machine, that can have a lot of effect. Right, and versus as much as as well organized and as smart as we are in our small collective, there's limits to what we can do. But if you can get that institutional structure going in the right direction, that seems to me usually a worthwhile endeavor.
I just want to add to that. There absolutely is a law on the accreditation of student associations in Quebec, and universities can't actually unilaterally take student funds away. Student unions are analogous to labor unions, right? And so my advice would be to not abandon your student union, to absolutely do everything possible to take power of your student union, right? If, the Canadian government might put through all kinds of legislation to send workers back to work, right? Calling them essential workers when they go on strike. They might try to do all kinds of things to curtail the power of unions. Does that mean that workers should stop organizing through their unions? Absolutely not, right? So I think the same thing with students is that we have to fight to have power of your unions and take control of it. But that also doesn't necessarily mean it's going to end up in an automatic victory, right? Like you said, those court decisions also don't exist in a vacuum. We also have to we kind of have to do both, right? You also have to have power in the streets and have mass mobilized, right, student body to show that the university cannot get away with that behavior.
Thank you. Do we have any questions online? I hear it beeping. Oh, okay. Questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, my name is Sam Bosky. A bit less of a question than a comment. As someone who watched both 1969 and 212 rather closely, I'm struck listening to the speakers today about all sorts of parallels between the two of them. And Yves, you'll have to excuse me because I think the Netanyahu situation was probably a horse of a different species. But in both 69 and in 212, you had a situation where there was a whole group of people who saw the university as being a vehicle for them to be able to progress. The university was going to be able to give them something which was allowing them to move to another stage, people who had traditionally seen themselves being subject to various kinds of oppression, who were going to be able to have a certain kind of development that university represented them. And in each case, an institution put its foot down and blocked them, contrary to whatever the university or the government at the time ostensibly had been promising. And the regular systems broke down, and people got angry, and then the answer of the administrations was repression. So you have these parallels in both, and I think the reason why both these issues ended up exploding and ended up becoming preoccupations of much larger society is that the values which were represented here also resonated with all sorts of feelings in the larger society. I think Rodney made it very clear, in his explanations that at least for those of us outside, I was a student at McGill at the time, and many of the progressive McGill students came down regularly to demonstrate and support the Concordia students, and I was on the 9th floor as recently as 24 hours before the computer fire. And why we were there, I never met the 6 students who complained, I never met Anderson, but what was clear to us was when the university was confronted with an issue where there were allegations of possible racism, and I will make a parallel to our Premier Legault being confronted with allegations of systemic racism. On both occasions, they completely refused to entertain the idea, and they refused to do a serious examination of this, and whatever kinds of inquiries were set up reluctantly ended up being false and phony and were very clearly not intended to examine the question which was important to the students who were involved. And at Concordia at the time in Sir George, this involved lots of students, not just black, but white as well. Lots of professors were involved, the teachers' unions were involved, and in every step along the way, the university administration basically refused to deal with this issue in a serious way. If we're looking for a contemporary parallel, we have Hockey Canada this week, who has been faced with an issue and has clearly refused to deal with an issue in a way, and so it ends up exploding. And the fact that the university decided to repress and call in the police were very brutal at Concordia in Sir George. I had been the year earlier involved in was in a student occupation at McGill at the principal's office and been carried out by the police, and they treated us with kid gloves. But at Sir George, they were brutal, and various people were hurt, and many people were imprisoned for I have the impression it was weeks before they got out, and then there were long trials. And it was very clear from the reaction of the university and the reaction of many of the students that there was a tremendous amount of racism involved against the students who had originally brought the issues. And this was something which resonated because in the rest of Montreal society at that point, remember 1968, 69, there had been protests all over the place. There was student occupations in all parts of the world. There was Columbia, there was Paris, so the idea that here as well we were confronted with an institution which refused to admit that there might be institutional racism in its own institution and use repression to those who were raising this issue was something which resonated. 2012, again, it was relatively parallel, and from my point of view, I was working for the Education Ministry at the time, and I had a bird's eye view. Before the Maple Springs, students were occupying a park across from the Education Ministry for about 9 or 10 months. And so we got to talk to the students every day going into work. And here again, a whole generation of Quebec students who were seeing the university as a means of being able to move to a place where they could occupy a place of importance in the world. Many of these students whose grandparents probably had not gotten by elementary school, their parents probably would have finished high school, may have gone to Cégep, but they were the first generation immensely who had gone to university. And here, suddenly, by completely raising the school fees, the government was going to stop them from being able to complete, or else burden them with student debt, which was going to sort of hypothecate their future for the next couple of generations. And where, again, they thought that by negotiating, by trying to protest against this, they might be able to get something, the government screwed them around and set up all sorts of bogus negotiations and tried to involve people in all sorts of strange activities which had nothing to do with wanting to really come to a settlement or deal with the issue in question. And I think where the students at the time were very perspicacious, and Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois wrote about this very well in his book, which everybody should read, and it was translated into English. It should be in the library. It's called In Defiance. If you don't want to read the book, you can read a review of it that I wrote in the online publication Montreal Sarai, where I did a review of the book. The students saw that it, unlike the Gazette editorialists who said, oh, these are spoiled kids, they're paying far less fees than people elsewhere, they saw that this was the thin edge of the wedge, that the government was cutting back on universities, but they were also cutting back on healthcare. They were rolling back all the gains of the Quiet Revolution and trying to corporatize the economy. At the same time that the protests were going on, Jean Charest was trying to open up with his Plan Nord, northern Quebec to multinational corporations so that they could, sort of recolonize it another time. And again, the reaction of the government was to bring in the police. And by bringing in Bill 78, as you mentioned, and by the police being very violent with the nightly demonstrations and kettling hundreds, there were thousands of people arrested over a period of a couple of months for doing nothing more than walking peacefully when the government said, you're not allowed to walk peacefully and you're not allowed to express your ideas. So there was all sorts of parallels here, and during the Printemps Arable as well, you had a lot of people from the outside community suddenly realizing that it's our, the values we thought our government had are being attacked as well. And so that, this became much more than just a student protest, but it became a societal protest, and ultimately the government fell. And
Absolutely.
But I'm struck today, listening. The parallels in terms of the fact that the institutional responses to, valid movements for self-affirmation that the university might have represented for people were being quashed, and these parallels are really amazing.
That's such a rich context for us, especially for those of us who might not have been there at the time. I think we have time for one more question.
Is anyone?
We do. I just remind you that we do close in 5 minutes, so
Okay. Or
maybe make it quick.
Very short question.
Yeah, I was really curious. For me, I really struggled when I was graduating, leaving behind the activism that I was involved in. And I found a lot of comfort in Sarah Ahmed's work on just like leaving scratches behind and like haunting the institution. And I just was curious for the three of you, what was that like moving on process like, and how, what was that moving on process like, and how do you find peace in what's been done, but still find those steps for what your future work can look like?
And can I just ask you to keep your responses brief? Thank you.
I was expelled, so I was, I never finished my degree. So the moving on, I didn't have an option. I think I used the gym over there a few times, and security came and kicked me out of the former gym. But yeah, I mean, I think there's, university activism is great. There's all kinds of institutional things that enable it, but we should be engaged in all different segments of our life. And personally, I gotten very engaged in Haiti solidarity and different international sort of solidarity, fighting Canadian foreign policy. So, I didn't find it particularly difficult. I found there's lots of other domains that I've, wanted to be engaged with. Yeah. So.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think similarly, I kind of refused to move on. I stuck around Concordia a while. I had to discontinue a few courses and ironically rack up student debt so that I could be as involved as I was in the strike, or at least in the lead up to the strike. But since then, I mean, I've continued to be involved in various organizing. I've worked for labor union. I'm currently a nonprofit, and continue to plan to do that in my life. And I think that's something that we've seen quite a bit of from the 2012 generation, is a lot of former students now organizing their workplaces, right? Not necessarily as like paid labor staff, but also as workers. I think that's one of the most powerful things that we can do.
Thank you. And Rodney, I'll leave you with the last word. How have you moved? How did you move on after 1969, or what kind of activism continued for you? And if you can just keep it brief, please.
Yeah, briefly, I went back to Sir George, Concordia, did 8 years of graduate studies there. Feeling somewhat alienated in the department. In terms of minority students at graduate school, there weren't that many of us. Then I moved to Toronto. I continued my search for peace in education, got another 2 degrees. And I haven't really moved on. I am still stuck with the sense of who am I in that larger question of identity. I'm still trying to deconstruct what it means to be a Black person in a white community.
Yeah.
And what I would say is that for all people, all dispossessed people, you never reach the end. There's no moving on. There's simply continuing the struggle in whatever arena you find yourself in.
Yes. Thank you. Those are wise words for us to end on, to think about the lingering judgments that people who engage in activism and take the risks that you all have sometimes face, but also the transformative possibilities for change that you've given us. Thank you. Just in wrapping up, I want to make an announcement that anyone who scans the QR code will be entered in an end-of-the-month draw for a sustainability gift bag, and anyone who scans the QR code from each of the 4 weeks of the Get Radical series will be entered into the draw for an Espace pour la Vie 12-month passport. So thank you all for staying with us and for your rich questions, and we're going to be engaging as well afterwards.
There's some food called 7th floor in the art.
So huge thanks to our guests.